Welcome to this review on guidelines for radiation safety protection. This is a review of all of the radiation safety rules and regulations relevant to nuclear medicine. This is a short list of the governing agencies for nuclear medicine. Our field is heavily regulated, so there are quite a few different agencies that play a part in governing our field. The primary one is the NRC, which stands for Nuclear Regulatory Commission. They house and regulate all of the federal laws that have to do with storage, use, transportation, and administration of radioactive materials. The FDA is the Food and Drug Administration. They regulate our radiopharmaceuticals for human use. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, regulates the disposal into waste and things like that of into the environment of radioactive materials. Department of Transportation has a memorandum of understanding with the NRC, and they regulate the transportation of radioactive materials. And then, of course, we have state agencies. A lot of states are agreement states, and they will have their own rules regulating transportation, storage, use, administration, record keeping, all of that related. And the NRC will their agreement is between the state and the NRC to allow the state to enforce. One of the caveats of being an agreement state is that the state has to agree to be as strict or stricter than the NRC. So these are the primary regulations. There are a few others, which we'll talk about later, but the primary ones are found in Title 10 of the Federal Code of Regulations, 10 CFR 19, which talks about the notices, instructions, and reports for workers. These are sort of vague, and they're explained a little bit more in Part 20. Part 20 has to do with all things radiation protection. That's where we find our dose limits, more specific instructions on signs and postings and things like that. And then 10 CFR 35 is the medical use and use of byproduct material. And then these are all based on recommendations from International Commission on Radiologic Protection. That's abbreviated as the ICRP, and the National Council on Radiation Protection and Measurement, which is the NCRPM. And then the U.S. Department of Transportation, like we said, DOT has the shipping regulations, and then the Food and Drug Administration has the pharmaceutical aspects. So the International Commission on Radiologic Protection was founded in 1928. They have developed, maintained, and elaborated the international system of radiologic protection that's used worldwide and as a common basis for the radiologic protection standards. They are an independent international organization. They're made up of more than 200 volunteer members from 30 different countries across 6 continents. They are all experts in the field of radiation safety and radiation biology, and they're the world's leading scientists and policymakers in the field of radiologic protection. It is important to note they are not a governing institution. They are just a board of international experts who make recommendations, and then countries typically adopt those recommendations. The National Council on Radiation Protection and Measurement was chartered by Congress in 1964 as the National Council on Radiation Protection and Measurements. This is the US's version of the International Commission. Sometimes people will serve on both, or they'll serve on one and then move to the other. But they are our National Board of Experts. They provide a means by which organizations concerned with scientific and related aspects of radiation protection, quantities, units, and measurements can cooperate for effective utilization of their combined resources. They develop the basic concepts of radiation quantities, units, measurements, and the application of radiation protection. They cooperate with the ICRP the Federal Radiation Council, the International Commission on Radiation Units and Measurements, and then other national and international organizations, including working and cooperating with the NRC. So this is the NCRP. They have 13 members on their board of directors, and they have 79 collaborating organizations, 100 council members, and then they have 7 different program areas or committees. Now we get to the NRC guidelines. The Energy Reorganization Act of 1974 is what established the NRC, and they were established to independently regulate commercial uses of nuclear material, including nuclear power, and other duties that were formerly part of the Atomic Energy Commission when it was disbanded. So they formulate the policies and federal regulations that govern nuclear reactor and material safety, issue orders to licensees, and they adjudicate legal matters that are brought before them. The NRC, remember that stands for Nuclear Regulatory Commission, they control the use and distribution of radioactive materials. They monitor those with licenses to ensure safe and effective use, and they issue regulations that then must be followed. And remember, that's part of the Code of Federal Regulations, so those are federal laws. And then they issue licenses for medical use, research, educational, and industrial use, and so forth. And then we have the agreement states. Like I said earlier, the agreement states have to agree to be just as strict or more strict than the NRC regulations. And in return, the NRC will transfer their regulatory and licensing power over to the state. It is important to note that the states are still overseen by the NRC when they become agreement states. So the state will inspect your department to make sure that you're following the state laws and all of those things. But the NRC will also inspect the state to make sure that the state is withholding their own laws and following the NRC regulations. So the NRC still oversees those states, but they have kind of delegated the regulatory and enforcement power to the states. An agreement state is a state that has signed an agreement with the NRC authorizing the state to regulate certain uses of radioactive materials. The NRC will still oversee VA and federal institutions, nuclear reactors, and that kind of thing. But the state oversees personnel licensing, the hospitals, regular nuclear medicine departments. The state will take over those roles and just the overall day-to-day activities and regulations that impact nuclear medicine departments. The states must agree to have the rules the same or stricter, and then by doing that, some states actually just copy and paste the NRC regulations into their rules and they enforce them the same. Other states will go a little further. They'll have their own version of forms and slightly different wording and things like that. And then the states must have training and an entity dedicated to performing the tasks normally governed by the NRC. This is usually a state licensing board or a state bureau of radiation control or state radiation protection board. They'll have various names, but it all kind of means the same thing, where they're just overseeing the day-to-day activities and licensing in that state. So this is a list of the agreement states. There are only a few non-agreement states left. Those are Idaho, Montana, South Dakota, Missouri, Michigan, Indiana, and West Virginia. Wyoming has a letter of intent, so does Vermont. All the other states are agreement states and will have their own licensing. I forgot NRC still oversees Hawaii and Alaska as well. There are several NRC regions. Well, several. There's 4. There in the Northeast is Region 1 that covers like Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, and everything northeast of that. Region 3 is Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, all the way over to Ohio. So that includes Michigan, Wisconsin, everything in between. And then everything else that's east of the Mississippi, that's kind of in the southeast, that would be Florida, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. That's in Region 2. And then Region 4 covers everything west of the Mississippi. That's a very, very, well, plus Mississippi. It's a very, very large region, and that also includes Alaska and Hawaii. Their main headquarter office or regional office is in Texas. And so that's pretty far from states like Alaska, Washington, Oregon, Idaho. And so a lot of times there will be some type of state contact within each state that kind of reports back to that regional office. So licensing could be it's important to note that the NRC does not give personal licenses. They do institution or facility licenses. And agreement states a lot of times technologists have to get a license. This is very different from their certification. Certification comes from the NMTCB or ARRT. That just states that you have the knowledge, skills, competency to be able to work in the field and that you've gone to school for it. The state license gives you a license to work. It's almost like passing a driver's ed test and getting a certificate. That still doesn't allow you to drive in your state. It only says that you have the education, training, and skills to be able to drive, but then you still have to go to the state DMV and get your driver's license. And a lot of times as a new driver, you have to have driver's ed training in order to do that. Same thing with our personal licenses with our agreement states, where you still have to go to school, you still have to get certified, but then you have to also get a state license, which just gives you the ability to work within that state. The NRC doesn't do any of that. That's all for agreement states to do, and it's just a way that they can ensure the people who are performing nuclear medicine are qualified. The NRC licenses that they give are facility licenses. And there's a couple different kinds. Limited scope is limited, only issued to individual physicians or institutions being able to operate at a specific place with very limited types and quantities. And that is actually what most places have. Most doctors' offices, hospitals, things like that will have a limited scope, where the license actually says the type and amounts of radiation that they're allowed to have. There will be authorized users on there, which are the individual physicians. And then the broad scope is for larger institutions. You'll find this at very large institutions that are doing a lot of research, have their own cyclotron, have their own radio pharmacy in-house, things like that. It covers more radionuclides and in larger quantities. And then you have the research licenses, and this allows them to do research with radiation, and they have a non-human and a human use one. And then, like I said, the individual licensing is not done by the NRC. That's usually up to the agreement states. Not all agreement states are licensure states. Gets very confusing. The SNMMI and the ASRT both have web pages dedicated to seeing what the rules are in each state for individual licenses, what you're allowed to do with them, whether or not you need a license. And that also includes nuclear medicine tech's ability to do CT in certain states. So I encourage you, if you ever have that question and you're moving to a new state, to go to the ASRT or SNMMI websites where those state requirements are listed. Another thing to consider is restricted versus unrestricted areas. Unrestricted areas are areas that have access to the general public. Radiation levels in these areas should be at or near background. It is very important to keep those areas at or near background. And a lot of times we have to do our daily surveys to make sure that the unrestricted areas are kept at or near background. And then restricted is areas where access to which is controlled by the licensee for the purpose of protection. So restricted area are areas that are not accessible to the general public. This is usually areas where our radioactive materials are stored or used, and it is restricted to those not required by work or permitted by license to be there, and they must be clearly marked with radiation warning signs. An example in a nuclear medicine department, your imaging areas and your waiting room are typically able to be assessed by the general public. Of course, your patients are in those areas. And so those are considered unrestricted areas. You do your daily surveys in those areas to make sure that there's no contamination and that there's no excessive exposure to the public. But then your hot lab would be a restricted area. This is where your radioactive materials are stored and used, and it's likely to be above background just because there's radiation present. And so if you remember, there's always signs on the hot lab door that tells you that it's a radiation area, and it has to be not accessible to the public, and we do that by keeping a lock on the door. So that's just an example of restricted versus unrestricted areas. And keep in mind that there are rules for those. It's very important for you to remember that. These are some of the signs that you will see. Notice there's one over here on the right that says caution restricted area. That's one that you'll see often as you're going into a nuclear medicine department or on a hot lab. Sometimes hospitals will put that on the outside of a nuclear medicine department just because they don't want people wandering in. They want to make sure that that area stays controlled. And then the caution radioactive materials, you'll see that on your sealed sources, the package for your cobalt sheet source, things like that, you'll see that on there. You probably won't see danger high radiation areas. You shouldn't really be working in an area where you see that. It's good to know, but it's probably not something you really see on an everyday basis. Now, as far as the FDA goes, this does regulate the preparation and administration of radiopharmaceuticals, sets guidelines for safe use and administration. Those guidelines for information are on the package insert. Very important that you guys know how to find those package inserts. They'll be on the FDA website. Whoever the drug manufacturer is, they will also have them publicly available, usually on their website. And most of the time you can just Google search for it and you'll find the package insert. But these package inserts have, it's mandated by the FDA. Certain things have to be in the package insert. And so you'll see like drug name, dosage information, indications for use, all of the possible adverse side effects, the pharmacodynamic information on how to use it. So all of that stuff is regulated by the FDA. And so the package inserts are pretty consistent with the information that's in there and even how it's formatted. The FDA regulations for diagnostic radiopharmaceuticals are in 21 CFR 601, subpart D, that deals with the diagnostic radiopharmaceuticals. And then the EPA regulates the environmental impact of the use and disposal of radioactive materials. They set the regulations for safe storage and disposal, and they set limits for release into air, sewer, water supplies, and ground soil. And this is just a quick reference guide from the EPA. The radioactive rule is in 64 of the Code of Federal Regulations. And the general rule is that mostly is applying to like radium and alpha particles, but They will have the limits over here. Beta and photon emitters, it's 4 millirems per year. Gross alpha particles is 15 picocuries per liter. Uranium is 30 micrograms per liter. So that's where you have those limits of what can be released into storage. Now we're going to talk about 10 CFR 19 in a little bit more detail. 10 CFR 19 has your notices, instructions, and reports to workers. This details workers' rights and the requirements of posting notices to workers, reports of exposure, instructions to workers if they're likely to receive greater than 0.1 rem per year, and then options available to workers regarding inspections and working conditions. So the standards for protection against radiation exposure is in 10 CFR 20. This has to do with the ALARA program, dose limits for workers, surveying, monitoring, signs and postings, storage and disposal, labeling, and then keeping records. 10 CFR 20 has a lot of the same information in 10 CFR 19, but it's more detailed. And then 10 CFR 35 talks about the medical use of byproduct material. So it has uptake, dilution, and excretion studies, which is diagnostic nuclear medicine that does not require a written directive. Imaging localization studies for diagnosis, which is also nuclear medicine with no written directive. Unsealed sources for therapy. This one does include the nuclear medicine therapy that requires a written directive. The brachytherapy, sealed sources for diagnosis, sealed sources for therapy, and then other medical uses. So we'll focus on 10 CFR 19 to start. And like I said, that is notices, instructions, and reports for workers. So this applies to anybody who receives, possesses, uses, or transfers material licensed by the NRC, including persons licensed to operate production or utilization facilities. So this applies to nuclear medicine. At the beginning of the chapter, it has definitions. This is important because it does define a radiation worker as well as restricted and unrestricted areas. Restricted areas defined as an area access to which is limited by the licensee for the purpose of protecting individuals against undue risks of exposure. It does not include residential quarters, but that's important to remember, restricted versus unrestricted, because there are different regulatory exposure limits for each. And this part talks about the posting of notices to workers. There are a couple notices that have to be posted. The regulations in part 19 and 20 of the chapter, the license conditions, or documents incorporated into the license. And so that just says your license has to be posted. The operating procedures applicable to those license activities. So a lot of times the RSO and emergency spill procedure have to be posted, as well as the NRC Form 3, which is the notice or rights to workers. And then it also says you have to post any violations. This is a copy paste of the regulations, but it just says that Form 3 has to be posted. Remember, NRC Form 3 is the notice to employees, and that's really important that that is posted. Some agreement states will have their own version. When they have their own version, you need to post the one that's for the state. Some states enforce it if you have the NRC one instead, some don't, but you have to have that notice to employees posted. And if you're an agreement state, I recommend that you have the state one, the state's version posted, because they're the ones that are inspecting you, that gave you that license. Those forms will basically say the same thing, though, is that workers have rights And it kind of notifies them that they're being exposed to radiation, tells them that they have rights, and then, they have a right to participate in inspections, they have a right to speak to inspectors, and that their employer cannot retaliate against them if they do speak to them. So these are instructions for workers, and this applies to any individuals who will receive 100 millirems, which is 1 millisievert per year. And they have to be kept informed of the storage, transfer, and use of radiation or radioactive material. They have to be instructed in health protection problems associated to exposure, instructed in and required to observe the applicable provisions of commission regulations, instructed in their responsibility, instructed in appropriate response, and advised of radiation exposure reports. So this is a really important part of 10 CFR 19 that protects workers. Anybody that's occupationally exposed in excess of 100 millirems or 1 millisievert per year has to have access to their badge reports. They have to be trained in the appropriate response and warning signs. So they have to have that radiation safety training. And this has a kind of sister guideline in 10 CFR 20 that goes into a little bit more detail of how that radiation safety training needs to be done, how often they get their dosimetry reports. And so in 10 CFR 19, it just says it has to be done. But in 10 CFR 20 is when it goes into a little bit more detail about making sure it's done, keeping records that it was done, and then how frequently it needs to be completed. 10 CFR 19 also has notifications and reports to individuals, radiation exposure data for individuals, and the results of any measurements, analysis, and calculation of radioactive material deposited or retained in the body shall be reported to the individual. And so this is just saying that if you are exposed to radiation, then that has to be reported to you, and each notification shall be in writing and shall include like certain information, right? The name of the licensee, the name of the individual, that kind of stuff. Each licensee shall make dose information available to workers as shown in the records maintained. So like I said, this regulation is telling us that the facility has to provide you with your dosimetry reports. And then 10 CFR 20 details how frequently and that it needs to be signed and all of that stuff. 10 CFR 19 actually says that you have to provide an annual report. And so your facility should provide you with an annual report of your radiation exposure. And then at the request of the worker, that should be provided to you by your employer. That's basically what this section of 10 CFR 19 says. It's just goes into a lot of detail to just make sure that workers have their rights to their dosimetry records, and their reports of exposure have to be provided to them. This also says that the records are maintained by the licensee, and that's in 10 CFR 20, how long facilities have to keep those dosimetry reports and how they have to keep proof that they provided them to the workers. But 10 CFR 19 just says that it has to be done. And this talks about reporting any exposure of an individual of radiation or radioactive material. And it's just saying that that report also has to be given to the NRC. So at the request of a worker who's terminating employment with the licensee involved in exposure, then each licensee shall provide a written report regarding the radiation dose. So if you ever quit a job and you go to a new job, your old employer has to provide you with a copy of your dosimetry records. Sometimes they don't have an address for you if you move. So that's one reason that you need to provide your former employer with a current address. You also have the right to request that, and they need to provide that to you. So that helps to keep track of your lifetime exposure and make sure that your lifetime exposure is accurate. 10 CFR 19.14 just talks about the workers' rights during inspections. And like I said before, it just says that you do, as a worker, have a right to be present and speak to inspectors, and that they can't really retaliate against you for anything that you say. But of course, if you lie, there are repercussions for that. So you should never lie or make a false report. But if you do have serious radiation safety concerns, you have a right to bring that forward. And this is just copy and pasted, but basically just reiterates what I just said. 10 CFR 19.15 says that commission's inspectors may consult privately with workers concerning matters of occupational radiation protection or exposure. And so this is basically a regulation for the hospitals and clinics, saying that those inspectors do have a right to speak to them. Sometimes you'll find workers that are or facilities that maybe know they're not doing things the way they should, or they're afraid to get cited for something by the NRC or the state, and so they will only let the inspectors talk to certain people, and they'll try to gatekeep that. But this is actually a regulation that says that, hey, workers have a right to bring forward any concerns to the inspectors, and the inspectors have a right to speak to any workers during their inspection that they want to, and they have a right to do that privately without any repercussions from the licensee. And remember, when I say licensee, I'm talking about the facility. And then this part, 10 CFR 19.16, has to do with requests by workers for inspections. So any worker or representative who believes that there's a violation has a right and a responsibility to report that to the NRC. You'll find the same language in the state. So if you are at a place where your employer is not providing you with dosimetry badges, not giving you dosimetry reports, they're asking you to do things that you know are in violation, you do have a right to report that and request an inspection. Sometimes there are repercussions with your employer, so remember, you should only do that if you really have true concerns and not as a retaliatory measure. You need to make sure if you are reporting something like that, that it is an honest concern and an honest report. And if the administrator of the appropriate regional office determines with respect to a complaint that an inspection is not warranted because there's no reasonable grounds to believe that a violation exists, he shall notify the complainant in writing of such determination. So if you do report something and the inspectors at the regional offices or whatever believe that, oh, you're just a disgruntled former employee, or for whatever reason they don't think that it's a true violation or something that they need to inspect, they will notify you in writing of your complaint, and then it's kind of like the complaint is dismissed without prejudice kind of thing. So you do have the ability to report again if you need to. But there might be repercussions for you if you just keep calling and reporting a former employer. And this is a copy of the NRC Form 3, which is the notice to employees. And I know this is small, you can't really see it, but it gives a lot of detail about what the NRC is and what they do. Your worker rights, if you see right here, it says, may I talk with an NRC inspector? May I request an inspection? So a lot of this top part is just FAQ, like what does the NRC do and what are my rights as an employee or a worker? And so it even says like what the NRC will do if they find anything and things like that. And then the second section talks about the NRC regions where the regional offices are located, and then it gives the contact information for those regional offices. So if you are an employee and you see a problem, you are able to report it. There's also a safety hotline, notice of an inspector general, and then it kind of highlights and refers back to 10 CFR 19 that requires employers to have access to all this other information. And so that's the NRC Form 3. All right, so now we're going to talk about 10 CFR 20. 10 CFR 20 has to do with standards for protection against radiation exposure. So this has some of it is kind of repetitive from 10 CFR 19, but it goes into much more detail. And then it has more strict kind of guidelines of how these things need to be documented, enforced, how frequently they need to be done, and that type of thing. So radiation protection programs, this is where you'll find information on internal dosimetry and ALARA, the dose limits for workers, radiation surveys and monitoring, storage and disposal of radioactive material, signs and postings, labeling of radioactive materials, and then the records and reports for those, as well as penalties for noncompliance. Every 10 CFR section has a place at the end for penalties for noncompliance. They also all have definitions at the beginning of the chapter. All right, so general provisions. So the very beginning of the chapter, like I said, it talks about definitions and things like that. Every chapter starts this way, so you'll have the purpose, the scope of the chapter, the definitions. 10 CFR 20 also has the units of radiation dose and units of radioactivity defined, because it does talk about dosimetry and ALARA exposure limits and things like that. And then it also has other just kind of office administrative things there at the end. So radiation protection programs is found in subpart B. So 10 CFR 20 says each licensee shall develop, document, and implement a radiation safety program that is commensurate with license activities and sufficient to ensure compliance. So you'll find more information on what a radiation safety protection program is in 10 CFR 35. They kind of build off each other. But in 10 CFR 20, it says you have to have one. It also says that ALARA radiation safety program has to follow ALARA. That's the principles of as low as reasonably achievable. And then the licensee shall periodically, at least annually, review that radiation protection program, make sure it's being implemented. And so this is the regulation that says that should be done every year. And that usually includes employers reviewing the radiation safety guidelines and getting radiation safety training annually. So to implement the ALARA requirements in 10 CFR 20 and notwithstanding blah, 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 such as an individual member of the public being likely to receive a dose in excess of 10 millirems or 0.1 millisieverts per year. So you must strive to have occupational limits below or at ALARA 1 levels, and then an annual review of that exposure must be done with a report and signed off by the RSO. There should also be documentation that you're giving workers that annual report. A lot of times they have to sign it and then that gets filed. Monitoring of occupational intake and internal dose is also found here. So it's basically saying any adult that's likely to receive in excess of 10% of the annual limit of intake, or minors that are likely to receive greater intake than 0.1, and declared pregnant workers likely to receive greater than 0.1 rem, which is 10% of that, during their entire pregnancy. So this is setting limits for external and internal dosimetry. Remember, they're about the same, but with internal, it's referred to as ALI, or annual limit of intake, and that's just saying what you're allowed to take in, either orally inhaled or absorbed through the skin or ingested if you're eating it. But it's basically saying your occupational intake of your internal dose. So remember that you need to know the limits for both of those. So subpart 4 actually has those dose limits. These are your occupational dose limits, and these are the external ones. So total effective dose equivalent, that's your TEDI. That's 5 rems or 0.05 sieverts. You do need to know both rems and sieverts, so just know the conversion and then you'll be able to convert it one way or the other. The I's are 15 rems or 0.15 sieverts. So remember, you're moving the decimal point over 2 between sieverts and rems. So keep that in mind. Know you're going the right way. And then skin extremities, those are 50 rems or 0.5 sieverts. So here's a chart that just breaks that down for you. This is the occupational exposure limits. So whole body is 5 rems, 5,000 millirems per year. And then the lens of the eye is 15 rems, extremity is 50. The embryo or fetus is only 0.5 rems for the gestational period. So keep that in mind. That's 10% of what an occupationally exposed person would get for their whole body for the year. And it's for the gestational period, not for the year. So keep that in mind. And typically, when somebody declares pregnancy, like let's say they declare pregnancy in their 6th month, that doesn't mean that for the next 3 months they can get 0.5 rems. What the RSO will do is backtrack that to the estimated date of conception and then look at and count 0.5 rems for the entire gestational period. So that's important to keep in mind. Now, minors, you really don't see any occupationally exposed people that are less than 18. Very rarely you may see it if there's like a transporter or something that's a high school kid, but typically they're not really in the nuclear medicine department just because of the radiation exposure. But if you do see a minor, there's a limit for that, and it's 0.5. So it's 10% of the adult's annual exposure limit, and that one is for the whole year. And then the general public, this is important to remember as well. This is the whole reason that we do our daily surveys, is because we have to prove that we're not exceeding this. So the general public is 0.1 rem or 100 millirems per year. And then remember, we have ALARA 1 and ALARA 2 limits. Now, the ALARA 1 and ALARA 2 limits are not specifically part of 10 CFR 20, but they are widely adopted and used. And so they could either be quarterly or monthly. To find the monthly, you just take what's listed here in the chart and you divide it by 3. So the deep dose equivalent, which is your TEDE, your TEDE, that is 42 for ALARA 1 for your whole body badge, and then 125 for the ring. ALARA 1 is 10% of your annual limit divided into quarters or months. And then that is your trigger level. So that will trigger an investigation, usually a reminder for the technologist to use a syringe shield, spend less time with their patient, whatever they're doing with, whether it was their whole body or their ring that was over. Typically, if your whole body is not over, but your ring is, that's because you're not using a syringe shield. If your whole body's over, but your ring is not, that's typically what happens in PET if you're standing too close to your patient or spending too much time with them. So, and if you're over on both, you're just not being safe at all. So typically, if you're above ALARA 1, that will trigger the RSO to give you a reminder, and they may ask you what happened. If you're over ALARA 2, though, ALARA 2 is 30% of the annual limit for the quarter or the month. So basically, you take 30% of the annual limit, and then you divide that into either quarters or monthly, and that's what your level 2 limit is. That will typically trigger investigation and some corrective action. And that could be retraining. If they're going to be over for the year, that may be reassignment of duties for the time. Maybe it's repeating radiation safety training. Maybe it's, working with a mentor, having the manager watch you. I have seen some facilities where they actually require the tech to get signed off on competency in radiation safety skills. And usually they were repeat offenders, but the RSO has to document those things and prove that they were making sure that people were as low as reasonably achievable. And so a lot of states will actually require that RSOs document that, but it's just best practice. So if you go over ALARA 1 or 2, be prepared to have a talk with your RSO about what might have caused it to go over, and then just know it is going to be monitored and watched. And then the RSO has to sign off on your dosimetry records, either monthly or quarterly, whatever you're doing them at your facility. It's a minimum that it's done quarterly by most regulatory agencies. And then most people do monthly just so they can catch it sooner if somebody is above ALARA 1. 10 CFR 20 subpart D has radiation dose limits for individual members of the public. So this is where dose limits for the public have to be less than 0.1 rems for the year, or 100 millirems. This does not include background or cosmic radiation. We can't include that in it. This is the reason that we have to keep unrestricted areas at less than 2 millirems per hour. And so that's part of why we do the daily surveys. This is the reason why we do the daily surveys, is because we have to prove that we're keeping unrestricted areas and that we're keeping that dose to the public at a minimum. And so this talks about compliance with public dose. It says licensees shall make or cause to be made as appropriate surveys of radiation levels in unrestricted controlled areas. So 10 CFR 20 Part D A right here is where it's telling you that you have to do daily surveys, document them, and prove that these unrestricted and control areas are not overexposing the public. Occupational limits for minors is 10%. We already talked about that. And then we also talked about the declared pregnant worker. Notice it says declared. That is a pregnant person's choice to declare or not declare their pregnancy. So you might get some funny looks from your coworkers and your RSO if you never declare your pregnancy, but that is a right. Once you declare though, then the facility has to provide you with a monthly dosimetry fetal monitoring, and then that has to be monitored monthly. And if the exposure to the fetus is starting to trend high, like it may exceed 0.5 millirems, the facility has to take precautions to make sure that that doesn't happen. So most women will choose to declare because that is protecting them and their fetus. And they should not ever be punished for that, but it does watch them and they could be reassigned if their exposure is higher. If you are pregnant, do not wear a lead apron, especially if you're doing PET. You'll end up getting a little bit more radiation exposure to the baby or to the fetus that way. Some people think that it's protecting them because they wear lead aprons and X-ray, but it's lead, but it's really not protecting them. So it's a choice that some people make, but just know it's not really doing a whole lot for you. And if you're a declared pregnant worker, your facility has to provide you, it's right here in 10 CFR 20, they must provide you with fetal monitoring, and it has to be monthly, and it has to be proven that the fetus does not exceed 0.5 millirems during the gestational period. So compliance with the public dose, remember it must be less than 2 millirems in any 1 hour. That's why we do the daily surveys. And then it's necessary to stay in compliance with that. This is where it says that those records have to be kept for 3 years. So your daily surveys have to be kept for 3 years. And then this also has criteria for license termination. This applies to decommissioning of facilities, and it basically just says you have to decommission it and get rid of all your radioactive sources and your sealed sources and have a record for that and report that. You can't just leave the facility abandoned with sources or radiation producing machines inside. And then subpart F talks about surveys and monitoring a little bit more. Each licensee shall make or cause to be made surveys of areas, including the subsurface, may be necessary for the licensee to comply with regulations. They're reasonable under the circumstances to evaluate magnitude, extent of radiation levels, concentrations and quantities, etc. So all personal dosimeters that require processing to determine radiation dose must be processed or evaluated by a dosimetry processor that is certified and accredited in doing so. So that's just saying that when you get your badges, your dosimeter badges, and they get sent in, they're sent into a company. That company has to be a dosimetry processor that is certified or accredited to do that. And the whole reason for that is because they're putting that through equipment that's reading those dosimetry badges, and they have to prove that their equipment is working and that it's accurate. So that's all that part is saying, is that it has to be accurate. All right, so 10 CFR 20 says, that the licensee or the facility must supply and require the use of dosimetry badges. And so notice this says supply and require. I have seen a lot of cardiology offices or outpatient clinics that are privately owned. A lot of times they're owned by a doctor, and they want to make people purchase their own dosimetry badges. They can't do that. The NRC says that they have to supply them. So they have to supply workers with dosimetry. They have to do that for anybody that's likely to get 10% of the annual limit, or anybody that's entering a known high radiation area. And this part of the chapter just details conditions requiring individual monitoring. So it just says adults that are likely to receive in excess of 10% of the limits, minors who are likely to receive in excess of 0.1, declared pregnant women, and individuals entering high radiation areas. And this is 10 CFR 20.18, and this has to do with the security of stored material. This one does apply to us. The licensee shall secure unauthorized removal or access of licensed materials that are stored in controlled or restricted areas. So this is the reason that we have 2 locks on all of our restricted areas. So typically there's a lock to the hot lab, and then the radioactive materials are stored in a locked cabinet or drawer or something. Some places will have a lock on the nuclear medicine department and then a lock on the hot lab if they're not able to lock things up in cabinets or drawers or whatever. But the typical rule of thumb is that you need to have 2 locks to control the access or removal of radioactive materials. So this just says the same thing for storage. So control and maintain constant surveillance of licensed material that is in controlled or unrestricted area that is not in storage. And then subpart J talks about precautionary procedures. So this is where you'll find all the information for caution signs, posting requirements, exceptions to the posting requirements, labeling containers, and the procedures for receiving and opening packages. That's all in 10 CFR 20 subpart J. So this is where it tells us what that radiation symbol should look like. It does have specific requirements for how far apart these symbols you need to be. They're 60 degrees apart on all sides, and then it's got the circle in the middle. It has measurements for the size or, proportion to what it should be. And then it also says that it has to be magenta, purple, or black on a yellow background. So that is the official radiation sign. And then here are the posting requirements. Caution radiation area has to be posted when somebody is likely to receive 5 millirems in 1 hour at 30 centimeters from a source or shielded surface. So you may see this in the hot lab if you have a lot of materials in there, or you may see it on an uptake room for PET if it has an external door. 100 millirems to, I say external door, but I mean like a door that goes to a common area. 100 millirems in 1 hour at 30 centimeters for high radiation area. You're not likely to see high or grave danger, very high radiation. You still need to know those limits. The most important one to know is radiation area, the air concentrations one, or the storage of radioactive materials. So the airborne radioactive material you might see if the room is using xenon or storing I-131, as that can become airborne. And then use or storage of 10 times the quantity of the limited quantities for labeling. You'll see that as caution radioactive materials. And some states actually say that caution radioactive materials sign has to be posted anywhere where radioactive materials are used or stored. And so that's why that caution radioactive materials is the one that you're going to see on hot lab doors, because we do accept packages and things like that. So we will exceed that use or storage of 10 times the quantity of blah, blah, blah. And so those are signs that you need to know. Those are important. Know those limits, especially for the radiation area and the caution radioactive materials one. Subpart K has to do with waste disposal. This is where you'll find the method for obtaining approval for disposal, disposal of release into sewage, disposal by incineration, disposal of specific waste in compliant with like the EPA and things like that. Subpart L has to do with the records, records of radiation protection program, records of surveys, determination of prior dose, waste disposal, individual monitoring, monitors to the publics, all of that stuff. So records of radiation protection programs, it says that each licensee shall maintain records of radiation protection program, including the provision to the program and any audits, and that needs to be kept for 3 years. Remember, the licensee is the facility, not the person. So that's saying that the facility needs to keep record that radiation protection program is reviewed annually, and any changes that were made and any audits that were done to it, that needs to be kept for 3 years. Records of surveys, this mostly has to do with those daily surveys that you had to do. That has to be kept for 3 years as well. This talks about determination of prior occupational dose. So, and this is for anybody that's likely to receive 10% or more. And this is done on the NRC Form 4, which is an annual record, a written statement, or termination report. And this is basically like when you are starting a new job and they're looking at what your prior cumulative dose was. So let's say I worked at employer A for 15 years and then I left and went to employer B. Employer B needs to determine what my prior occupational dose is. So they could do that by looking at my last annual report from employer A, a written statement from employer A, or the termination report from when I left employer A. But they need to use something that shows what my cumulative dose was for the entire time of my employment with employer A, and then they can either retain those records if it's an NRC Form 4 until for the length of the license, or if they used like if they used like a written statement or anything like that, and then they prepared an NRC Form 4, which is the record of cumulative dose, they can throw those other records away and just keep the NRC Form 4. But something that shows that I had previous exposure and that they kept a record of that needs to be on file for the length of the license. And then this is the record keeping requirement for after, let's say after I started working for employer B. This is the regulation that says that this individual monitoring needs kept. So it's saying the deep dose equivalent, the estimated annual limit of intake. So if I had bioassays, those need to be kept. The effective dose for intake of radionuclides, all of that stuff needs to be kept. And if you have badge reports, it's all on your badge reports. But if you have bioassays, that's kept a different way because that doesn't go through your dosimetry. That would be just like a bioassay. So any of those records need to be kept. This is an example of the NRC Form 4. This is a fillable PDF that looks at the cumulative occupational dose history for a specific time period. And this is typically filled out by the RSO or somebody that's designated to be able to do that. And you'll notice it has different monitoring periods in there, so it can be filled out for multiple employees, and it just has their total dose on there. This is something that let's say I worked at 4 different employers and they were all monitored by the same dosimetry company. The dosimetry company might be able to provide that. But anyway, this is what that NRC Form 4 looks like. And this is saying those records need to be kept even after I left. So they shall maintain the records on NRC Form 5, which is the termination report. Those need to be kept for the length of the license. Also, like, let's say I was pregnant at employer B, they need to keep a record of that. And that has to be kept for the length of the license. And it also says it should be kept separate from the dose records. The dose records tend to be lengthy. This way, it's a way of making sure that it doesn't get lost. And this is an example of NRC Form 5. You may see that there's an equivalent form that's put out by certain dosimetry companies like Landauer, and it will be the same form for annual or for termination. And the clue will be that at the top it will say whether it's annual or termination, but it's kind of basically going to be the same. All of the doses are over here on the right. At the top it will say the monitoring period, the licensee name and number. And so most of it just has to do with the cumulative exposure over that period of time, either a 1-year period, because you get annual reports every year, or it will be for the entire time that you were employed there if it's a termination report. Now, records of dose to individual members of the public. Each licensee shall maintain records sufficient to demonstrate compliance. This is where you have to keep those records of your daily surveys. And it basically just says that you have to keep those just to prove that you kept the public safe. All right, so 10 CFR 20 subpart M has to do with all of the reports. And this is just like reports for theft of licensed material, notification of incidents, reports of exposures. And this part is, for the most part, fairly vague. It mostly just says that it has to be done. And there's more detail than in 10 CFR 35, but it just basically says those reports have to be done. This one is important reports to individuals exceeding dose limits. So if anybody does exceed like a LARA 1, a LARA 3, or typically people will provide a report or notify those people. But if they receive over the annual limit, then that has to be reported and kept on record, because that really shouldn't ever happen in nuclear medicine. Subpart N is exemptions of additional requirements, and this is just applications for exemptions and additional requirements. That's pretty vague and doesn't really something that you have to memorize. It's just something to know that if you ever needed to apply for an exemption, that's where you would find those regulations. And then subpart O has to do with enforcement of violations, criminal penalties for breaking it. Mostly it's fines, but it could be jail time if it's severe. And then there's a lot of appendixes to 10 CFR 20. So assigned protection factors, the annual limits on intake for derived air concentrations, quantities of licensed material that requires labeling, the NRC's regulatory office locations, nationally tracked sources thresholds. There's an Appendix F that's just reserved, which means there's like nothing there. It's just a blank page. And then Appendix D is requirements for transfers of low-level radioactive waste. So that's 10 CFR 20. And that concludes part 1 of our radiation safety review. Stay tuned for part 2. Thanks for watching.